Hello, everyone. My name is Father David Hollenbach, and I'm a professor here at Georgetown. I work in the School of Foreign Service, and I'm also a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center, which is one of the main sponsors of this conference. So I'm glad to be with you. And this panel is going to talk about the refugee issue from a more faith-based organization, and we're going to focus in particular on some of the reasons why faith communities are trying to make responses to the refugee and displacement situation in our world, and some of the issues that emerge in the response of those communities. The challenge is, of course, extremely great, as we saw from the presentation, especially the numbers given to us by Anna White. The number of displaced people in the world is at an extraordinarily high level, 120 million people in the world today having been displaced, both as refugees and as IDPs internally displaced within their own countries. Now, faith communities are among the agencies that provide large amounts of assistance to the displaced of our world. Indeed, the largest of these faith-based agencies are such as World Vision International, Catholic Relief Services, are about the same size, budget-wise and staff-wise, as the largest secular NGOs that are working for humanitarian assistance. The panel that we're about to have is going to try to help us understand better why faith communities seek to assist the displaced and what they can do to assist the displaced in a more effective way. We have an outstanding group of speakers to present some of the spiritual and ethical reasons for this engagement by faith communities. And our discussion will also open questions about how these communities can strengthen their work. Our panelists, I'm going to introduce them here, are Donald Kerwin. Don is the former director of the Center for Migration Studies in New York. Your handout there lists him from an agency that he worked with somewhat earlier, but he's in fact the immediate past director of the Center for Migration Studies in New York. Then we're going to hear from Cynthia Juarez Lang. Cynthia works with the Latter-day Saints Charities, the Mormon group that works on immigration and public policy, as well as with the firm Fragaman, which works extensively on immigration and public policy. We'll hear then from Noah Gottschalk. Noah is with HIAS, the Jewish agency that supports displaced people. And then finally, Asil Elborno from Islamic Relief USA, which is the US branch of the Muslim Humanitarian and Relief Agency. So I would open it up then by asking our first panelist, Donald Kerwin, to give us his insights into the role of faith-based communities in response to the situation we face today, and then we can go forward with our other panelists. So Donald, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Well, thanks to the Berkeley Center and to Michael for hosting this gathering, and to Beth Ferris and to David, who are really two of my big heroes in this field, for moderating these first two sessions. I'm going to speak, I think, first of all, on the normative principles and values that lead religious communities to do this work, to accompany refugees, to assist them as they can, and other forced migrants too. And then how faith communities draw on their own teachings and values to partner in this work with other faith communities and with human rights agencies and humanitarian actors of different kinds. On this last point, I'm also going to discuss what I think is a challenge, which is opposition, in the Christian world anyway, to migrant-serving agencies and the work that they do from their own co-religionists, which is something we don't talk about a lot, but it's a major challenge. So let me start with the Christian touchstones for this work. And this may be very basic for some of you, but pretty much migration plays a central role, as you know, in the narratives of many religions. To me, it can be very difficult to think about religious narratives that don't involve migration. Try it sometimes as an exercise. Come up with a single one that doesn't involve migration in some way. Hebrew scripture is really a touchstone for us. The experience of exodus and exile and dispersion and return. Based on their biblical experience, the Jewish people were taught not to oppress, but to love the stranger. Some version of this injunction is repeated apparently 36 times in the Pentateuch, or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. The New Testament, the narratives are there as well. God's journey to mankind through Jesus. It then segues to the Holy Family's journey to secure documentation as part of a census. The wise men's journey to witness and to glorify Jesus. The Holy Family's flight to Egypt, making them, according to the papal encyclical Exsul Familia, for all times and all places, the models and protectors of every migrant, alien, and refugee. As an adult, Jesus himself pursues an itinerant ministry in which he teaches that we will all be judged by what we do, or more so what we don't do, for the least, including welcoming the stranger. Moreover, he identifies very strongly with the least and the stranger. He commissions his disciples to spread the gospel to the nations of the world, the beginning of a missionary tradition. Bishop Jaime Soto calls the Acts of the Apostles a kind of travel log. And basically from this tradition, a migrant church and a body of social teaching emerges that stresses the rights of migrants, the common good, hospitality, the unity of people, the potential unity of people from diverse cultures, the dignity of work, and communion between natives and newcomers. So why do Christians assist migrants? Because we know migrants. We're never too far away from them in our own families, by the way. And we are migrants because our God identifies with migrants and because we believe that our salvation actually depends on these commitments. What about working with other religious communities and secular groups? I mean, there's all sorts of common ground, as you know, between different religions and their faith-based organizations, and I hope that maybe Noah and Asil can attest to that. The Abrahamic religions share a core belief in human dignity, respect for the integrity of all, the golden rule, justice, compassion, hospitality, and a belief that the world and the land ultimately belongs to God. And it's not just the Abrahamic religions. In Hinduism, Dharma, a term that speaks to the rules of the universe, the moral order, the cosmic law that governs life, extends to all people. There's a universality. So, I mean, we work with each other because we share similar touchstones and goals, and it benefits those that we accompany and serve. That's even more so one of the considerations. And we work with secular human rights agencies and other humanitarian agencies since we're strongly committed to human rights, which we believe are God-given. The Universal Declaration, just to kind of digress for a second on human rights, has abundant religious influences. The notion of subjective human rights actually arose in the Middle Ages in disputes over canon law. Our greatest gift, I think, in this work, not a threat or a burden, but a gift, are the migrants themselves. basically what we try to do is person-centered work. We take the perspective of the migrants rather than of states. And our greatest challenge, and David asked me to talk about this a little bit, and there's also, when we get lots and lots of support from our own communities, but it is a challenge that we have co-religionists in public life, and some Catholic institutions too, who fundamentally oppose our work, attack really the best of us, not me, but some people in this room for sure, basically those doing God's work, who champion the worst kind of policies, and who speak in the most degrading and dishonest ways about migrants. Let's be honest about it. For far-right, anti-migrant groups in the US and Europe and elsewhere, Christianity has become, according to one author, the identity marker of whether you belong to the people who comprise the state, although these groups would exclude plenty of Christians as well. So it's not just that you have to be a Christian. You could be excluded for other reasons too, but you do have to be a Christian to be part of the people, the core. They have their own concepts and language. For example, they talk about sovereignty as if it's this kind of godly, unconditional, absolute power to turn away desperate people. Really, our tradition vests states with the responsibility to protect rights and to promote the common good. In other words, states have affirmative responsibilities. And by the way, in a number of our gatherings at the Center for Migration Studies, including one right after Trump's first election, the immigrants there really expressed their bafflement that co-religionists not only fail to defend them, but they're actually the ones championing the policies and deploying the rhetoric that endangers them, divides their families, and damages their prospects. For his part, Pope Francis has decried those who, quote, appear to feel encouraged, or at least permitted by their faith, to support varieties of narrow and violent nationalism, xenophobia, and contempt, and even the mistreatment of those who are different. That's from Fratelli Tutti. He says that solidarity with migrants is exactly what our religion demands of us. We often hear it said, he says, that the situation of migrants is a lesser issue. That a politician looking for votes might say such a thing is understandable, but not a Christian, for whom the only proper attitude is to stand in the shoes of our brothers and sisters who risk their lives to offer a future to their children. Can we not realize that this is exactly what Christ demands of us when he tells us that in welcoming the stranger, we welcome him? So really, Christianity, what it's about gathering into one God's dispersed children. That's it. It's about unity. As the theologian Daniel Grudy put it, it doesn't restrict love of neighbor to those in a closely knit community of a single community or country or people, but it extends to anyone who needs me and who I can help. It seeks to bring wholeness and unity to a fragmented and divided human family and to bind all people together through love. That's a good description of what faith-based groups try to do. And I'd be happy to stop there and answer any questions, kind of when we get to them on what this next administration might do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Don. Now we can turn to Noah Gottschalk. If you would like to approach the podium, or you can remain in your seat, whichever you prefer.
That'd be great.
Okay, whichever you want.
Oh, yeah.
Whichever way you want to do it is fine.
I would love to be in my
us.
seat. Thank you. Everyone can still hear me okay, though, right? All right, good. So thank you so much. I want to thank the Berkeley Center, the organizers, everyone, my co-panelists for inviting me to be here today. I remember I went to Georgetown many years ago, and I remember being in this room on September 12th, 2001, talking about what we were going to do about the threats to many of us in the community who were being singled out because of their identity, because of their faith, because of their appearance. And then we held many religious service in this space as well, Muslim prayer services, Jummah prayers, Shabbat services. And so it's really a pleasure to be back here, and it feels very auspicious and timely to be here. So I think I'll start with reflecting a little bit about HIAS. Not to promote HIAS, but because I think that HIAS is, as an organization, tells the story of the American Jewish experience in a really unique and particular way. You know, I'm hearing a lot of organizations now putting out their statements after the election, and certainly we hope we'll have time to talk more about that. And a lot of them are saying things like, in the Jewish space, they're saying, as an organization that was founded 100 years ago, 110 years ago, 120 years ago, and it strikes me because that's around the time HIAS was founded, around the 1880s. There was this huge challenge, right, that was faced by folks in this country, and they responded by founding the organizations which exist until today, which are helping people until today, challenging anti-Semitism, racism, bless you, working with refugees, migrants, etc. And I think I found some inspiration and some hope in that. And so I want to talk about sort of who it was that founded HIAS and how this organization has evolved over the years. So as I said, around the 1880s, it's very hard to find an exact date, there started to be this explosion of persecution in Central and Eastern Europe, pogroms against Jewish people, and there had already been some Jewish people who had come to the US, and they started organizing committees. Today we might talk about mutual aid, right? They were organizing solidarity committees, which raised money to help bring people, often literally paying for steamer voyages, to come to the U.S. when there was a more open immigration policy, and then supporting people once they were here. And we have photographs of a Passover Seder at Ellis Island in 1913, for example, making sure that there was kosher food for people who were getting off the boats, maybe hungry because they didn't have much to eat during their journey. And so that was who founded HIAS, people who had themselves directly experienced immigration, who had immigrated to the US, sometimes just a few years before, trying to help their family members and their co-religionists, their community, to find the same opportunities as they had been offered in the US. And then we had a pandemic, and then we had very severe quotas on immigration, and specifically it's the 100-year anniversary, unfortunately, of the Johnson-Reed Act in 1924, which really slammed the doors shut on immigration to the U.S. And we've spoken a bit about that bill and its impact, which unfortunately lasts until today, during this year, since it is 100 years. And so HIAS at that moment, and it was then known as the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, terms we don't use anymore, we just use that acronym HIAS, then decided to globalize. It was this moment, what should we do? What's the choice? We can close, there's no more people we can bring here, or we can globalize. And so HIAS, fortunately, was driven by good leadership and decided to globalize and started helping persecuted Jewish people find other pathways, whether it was to Argentina or Mexico. Many places around the world had HIAS offices across Europe, even Asia, and Africa, and HIAS started becoming a global organization, finding pathways to safety for people wherever they are. And I was in Mexico recently, talking to members of the Jewish community there. There's literally more than 1,000 references to HIAS in the Mexican Jewish Archive, documents of people who left Morocco via France to then come to Mexico, supported by HIAS. And that was, I think, a huge part of what motivated that inspiration. And then and then we had another moment, and that was in the 70s and 80s, when continuing to help Jewish people, but then the Soviet Union collapsed, right? And that was the last big moment, thank God, that Jewish people needed to flee en masse from a place and look for safety. And then HIAS again was faced with another choice: to close up shop or to start helping other people, expand its focus to not only work with Jewish people in need, now that there weren't that many more Jewish people who needed our support, or work more globally. And we decided, fortunately, again, in this moment of inflection, the latter. And so as we say, we used to help refugees because they were Jewish, and now we help refugees because we are a Jewish organization. And that is really driven by, I would say, two main aspects that are so important. The first, as you've heard, is those 36 times in the Torah that we're commanded to welcome the stranger, to remember that we were strangers in the land of Egypt. That is, as far as I'm told by rabbinic scholars, the commandment that is most often repeated of any other thing, to do that. And the second is our own experience. So not just our historical experience, our biblical experience, but that recent experience that, that for many people it is within this lifetime. And, as we've been working with Jews, we're literally today trying to help Jews flee Iran to come to the US. That is an ongoing process. It's ongoing in people's lives. And it's basically impossible for me to give, don't ruin it for me here today, folks. It is almost impossible for me to give a lecture in one of these spaces or to talk without somebody raising their hand and saying that my family was helped by HIAS. And it's a really positive reflection of that connection that American Jews have. There is that deep-seated connection. And I think I've talked to many people who have said, the way that I express my Judaism is helping refugees. Most of our supporters, although we work with 99% non-Jewish people in our work, I would say, most of our supporters are American Jews, and they're American Jews who want to help other people because of their Jewish tradition, because of the biblical commandments, and because of their own experience, knowing what it means to have that opportunity, to have that ability to be rescued and have the opportunity to restart your life in dignity in a new place. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Noah. Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to an Islamic perspective from Asil Elborno. And Asil, you can lead. You can make your presentation either again sitting or at the podium, whichever you prefer.
I think I'll sit. We're having the
Stay
wonderful
there.
conversation
Okay,
together. Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
I'll stay right here. All right. So first, thank you so much for the Berkeley Center for inviting us here today. I thought I would start with my own refugee story, just to give an example of lived experience. And I apologize to some people in the room who've already heard my story several times. So just tune this part out. And then I will go into what does Islam say about migration, displacement, refugees, etc. So. To start off, so I'm with Islamic Relief USA, an advocacy manager, and I like to start with that because my story sort of explains how I got to where I am today and why I do what I do today. I am part of the second largest exodus up until what has happened in Gaza recently of Palestinians in history. So the first being the 700,000 that were displaced in 1948 after the creation of Israel, and then the second one being when Palestinians were displaced out of Kuwait during the Gulf War. So my family is part of that group of those who've been displaced. And the way that we ended up in the United States is that my little brother was actually born here in Washington, D.C. in a women's hospital that has now been closed. And a couple of years into his life, the Gulf War starts, and the United States government reaches out to my family and says, we are evacuating Americans, and we know that you have an American in your family, so we would like to get him out. And so my father said, well, he's 2, and so he's going to be staying with us, but thank you so much. And a couple of weeks later, the US government then reaches out again and says, okay, we're going to evacuate the families also of our US American citizens and to help you get out of this war zone. Great, fantastic. And so we are then evacuated and we leave everything. And I think it's really important to put into context what the experience of a refugee and someone who leaves in an emergency is like. We were allocated 2 pieces of luggage that we were then supposed to put our entire lives in, and we said goodbye to all of our family and our friends and all our belongings, and we were going to a place where we did not know what to expect. We were all bilingual, including myself, because I was in a private school, but many of the families that were with us that were evacuated were not. And we got resettled in North Carolina in 1990, and if you know anything about the South, you know that was a very segregated place at that time. And we kind of brought the diversity, the third prong of diversity, into that state. And I started my advocacy work at 7 years old, being the interpreter between the students that were, displaced alongside me and their teachers and the parents who didn't all have the language skills to be able to communicate. And then, I grew up in North Carolina. It was a wonderful experience. And then, 9/11 happened. And then it stopped being like a wonderful experience because I got to see firsthand racism in action. At the time in university, I was not veiled, so I was very white passing. And I was privy and privileged to be sitting into conversations that were extremely racist and xenophobic and Islamophobic. And that sort of urged me to start the first Middle Eastern North African Student Association on campus to bring cultural awareness and to let people know what the Middle Easterns were all about, besides bombs and terrorism, blah, blah. But we also have tabbouleh and debka and all these other fun things. So, learn more about us. And I graduated from university and I came to Washington, D.C. to sort of start my mark, and have been in the space of civic engagement since then. And one of the things that really moved me to that was when we finally were able to get citizenship, and many of our families that came along with us spent decades trying to go onto a path that would provide legal pathway. We were finally given that opportunity when I was about 19 years old. And I went into the immigration office to start my paperwork, and the immigration person said, you need to put your country of origin. And I said, Palestine. And he said, well, there's no such place. And where were you born? And I said, Kuwait. He's like, okay, so you're Kuwaiti. And I said, no, that's not how it works there. I don't have Kuwaiti citizenship. And he said, okay, that's fine, just put X. And being part of a stateless group of people where you feel constantly that you don't belong and that America is the place that you belong. And I think about all the people that were on our journey along that path, thinking of Salvation Army that came and helped us furnish our home that had been empty for a full month while we got resettled. But they were there to help. And all of the counselors and the teachers that were there to help along the way. It kind of reiterates the need for this faith-based and just human interaction. And so, because I only have 5 minutes left, that went really fast. I'm going to jump right into what does Islam say about refugees and displacement. So mobility and access to public services today are completely dependent upon where you are born. But in Islam, we know that it is your human right, despite where you have been born, to have access to housing, shelter, and food. That is a basic right. And that you have the right to also find dignity if you are in a place that is not providing that dignity. So we believe that migration is a part and paramount of our religion. And I'll also preface that I am not an Islamic scholar. So this is everything that I have learned about my religion and what kind of moves me forward and based on my experiences. So we know that migration is part and parcel of our experience and that we are allowed to roam the land. However, if you are displaced, there is a chapter in the Quran, it's called Surah An-Nisa, the women, and it's in verse 66. And God, when he's speaking to us through the Quran, says that being displaced is akin to being murdered. And being forcibly displaced and telling someone that they must leave their home is akin to telling someone that they must take their own life. That is how brutal being displaced is in Islam. And then you can ask any refugee, anyone today, would you have rather been displaced so that you could be quote unquote safe, or would you have rather stayed and not be a stranger in strange land? And most refugees will tell you, I would have wanted to stay in my home. I had no choice, I was forced. It's not like immigration, it's very different. So how does Islam say that we're supposed to treat the refugee? So there is a hadith, and a hadith means it is the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. He says, whoever grants respite to someone in difficulty or alleviates him, Allah, God, will shade him on the day of judgment when there is no shade. For us, shade is equal to safety. It is equal to dignity. And human rights in Islam, you have to have shade, shelter, clothing, and food. And there is a reference to the Christian king of Abyssinia, where the Prophet was telling his followers, go to this king. He is going to be treating you with dignity and respect, and he will give you refuge, and you will be protected in a dignified way. So our duty when we speak about refugees, oftentimes when we're referencing them, we're talking about how they bring so much to our communities, and this is why that we have to let them in, because they help our economies, they make our communities grow. But in Islam it says, even if they give zero contribution to our communities, it is our responsibility, it is our aman, like your calling, to treat refugees with dignity and respect, even if they bring nothing back. And I'll close because I only have 1 minute. How is time flying like this? I only have 1 minute, so I will reference one story about in the life of the Prophet Muhammad. When he was being persecuted in Mecca, he was told by God, go with your followers to Medina and you will be received there. And we have hadith after hadith, sayings of the Prophet, about how the welcome there in Medina was unlike anything that they had ever seen. The people, the Ansar there, not only welcomed them into their community, they welcomed them into their homes. They split whatever assets they had. If they had a house, they split the house in half. If they had food, they split their food in half with these refugees. And it wasn't for 3 months. It wasn't for 6 months. It was indefinite until these refugees were able to stand up and be self-sufficient on their own. So we have that example from our prophetic community, that this is how you treat the refugee, this is how you treat the displaced. That was the fastest 10 minutes of my life. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asil. Now, we'll turn to Cynthia Lang, whose name, unfortunately, was omitted from your program for today. It was on the original program that was distributed, but it was not on the one for today. So, Cynthia, the floor is yours. Again, you remain seated or the podium, whichever you prefer.
I'll stay here. I like this group. And I've been thrilled to be part of this working group here at Berkeley for the Berkeley Center for the last year. And working with a number of you has been very insightful, really helpful. And I'm thrilled that we're able to have the diversity we have, that we're able to get the panel that we did, and really appreciate your perspectives and look forward to some more discussion. I represent Latter-day Saint Charities, which is the humanitarian arm of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I represent them in this hemisphere at the Organization of American States. We do a lot of humanitarian work, including refugee work, but it's not limited to refugee work. And we've worked with all the other faith-based refugee groups represented here from time to time. And that is something probably I will end with, and what we want to emphasize is how much the faith-based groups do pull together and work together. And Don addressed the doctrinal basis for Christians to support refugees and did a great job. I can just give you a little bit more background on my church's view. I've spoken already at other panels that this working group has put together about my faith traditions and their origins. Like most religions, we believe it's a very important fundamental issue to love our fellow man. And it's the second greatest commandment, and it's an imperative. And doing that includes caring for refugees. In the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, our history, like many other faith-based groups, is one of refugees. We were driven out of places. We didn't have anywhere to go. We had to survive on the kindness of others and try to make our way across places where we wouldn't be persecuted. So we feel it, like many faith-based groups feel it viscerally. We've always provided assistance to others, but in 2015, the church began a very specific and targeted, comprehensive initiative at all levels, asking church members to provide support to refugees and migrants around the world. And this happened independently of what Latter-day Saint Charities does and what the organized church does, that in every congregation, there were initiatives started to be able to house refugees, feed refugees, welcome refugees, create welcome centers, play dates for refugee children, teach about the community, about the government, about currency, the finance system, things like that. Probably one of the best quotes that we were told is, being a refugee may be a defining moment in the lives of those who were refugees, but being a refugee does not define them. However, our response to refugees may define us. And I think that is how we view that. And with that, I think I will, I don't need to take the full 10 minutes. I think I'd like to turn it over to discussion, and I know I have questions for the panel. What do you think?
Sounds good. Okay, well, thanks very much to our panel. And this is an opportunity for us to open this up to conversation. I would just open initially, bring up one comment that I think would be useful in my response to hearing the four panelists already. Each of them has highlighted a way in which some of the normative scriptures, the Bible, the Quran, and so forth, have a very strong story to tell about why members of that faith community should respond to the displaced, to refugees and others who are. So we heard that very much going back to the Hebrew Scriptures, the story of being called to respect the stranger and in the Catholic community, Don Kerwin highlighted about how the normative framework, again going back to Jesus, Mary, and Joseph fleeing from Bethlehem to Egypt, seeking refuge from persecution. So you could say that Jesus, Mary, and Joseph met the contemporary definition of a refugee according to contemporary law by fleeing persecution across an international border. The Muslim experience, again going back to the roots, the migration of Muhammad and his initial followers from Mecca to Medina, the so-called hijrah, the migration, is the year zero on the Islamic calendar. So Muslims count time, count history from the days of the migration. And the displacement of Joseph Smith and the various Mormons from their homes and having to flee across parts of the United States and ending up in Utah mainly. And the migration experience of the Latter-day Saints is very real. So there's a normative basis in the foundational scriptures of these religious traditions, and there's deep experience of the reality of migration for the religious communities. Virtually all the religious communities in this country are here, except the Native Americans, are here as migrants and refugees. And therefore, there's a deep historical background for the. So the question then becomes how these faith communities can respond to the needs that we see in the world today and the various. And I think that we've heard good examples of how these different religious communities represented on the platform are responding to the needs of the displaced in our world today. But there's a lot more that needs to be done. And especially as we face the crisis of today, with so many displaced people in the world today, vastly larger than we've seen in the past. And the response needs to be equally larger. But unfortunately, as Don was suggesting, it's not. And the faith communities, at least the memberships of the faith communities, maybe not always their leaders, but the membership of the faith communities are not responding as fully adequately as they might be. So I would throw it for before we turn to the audience here, to the panel here if anyone would like to comment on what they think can be done to strengthen the faith community's responses today to the needs of the displaced in a way that we're not doing yet adequately, and in a ways that the normative framework and the historical experience of these communities call them to. So any suggestions about how we could do better in terms of responding to our history and our normative texts?
I mean, I'll just say very quickly that it's exciting to see Islamic Relief becoming the 11th resettlement agency here in the United States, being the first Muslim-based resettlement agency that was working with USRAP and with in collaboration with IRC. And I think that is one of the steps. My sister from the other panel from IRC, who I apologize, I forgot her name, she said something that resonated. She said that we need to go back to the grassroots, and that we need to be working in community on the local level, because the communities are the ones that know what best those communities need. And when you have partners that are culturally sensitive, culturally aware, are able to meet the needs of the community and meet them where they are at, that is one way in which we can create a more dignified resettlement process, at least here in the United States.
Okay. Yes, Don?
I actually think that that's all that works, to be honest, you know. And I was head of the legal agency for immigrants of the U.S. bishops for 16 years. So, and a lot of the work that we did at Center for Migration Studies was directly with community-based agencies. So the whole model there in those cases was to push down whatever we could push down and have people assume whatever they could assume and do what they couldn't do, basically. That was it. Because there's never enough resources, you know? And it's true, all the genius, all the good ideas, all the knowledge comes from the communities themselves. So that's the kind of shift that needs to take place for sure. And we can talk about human dignity and human agency and all of that. That's the way to speak about it. Or in the Catholic world, subsidiarity. You know, the people that are closest to a particular situation, have the most vested in it, they're the ones that need to be making the decisions. And kind of, it's not a top-down model. I don't like top and bottom, but you know, it's the people that are most affected, the people that are there. And in my kind of 33 years of doing this work, all of our successful projects involved that. Nothing else really worked.
Cynthia, you wanted to comment on that.
I think that in the coming days, when you say what could we do differently, I think things are going to change quite a bit for all these groups here. And I think that what has been done is a fellowship and a camaraderie and a working together with faith groups. I wouldn't say doing it differently, but I say more of it is going to be needed. There are going to be some of these faith groups that are going to be targets of the new administration. There may be criminal prosecutions for some of the work that's being done to assist refugees. I don't know that I think things are going to be so different that faith group, there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be there's fear a lot right now. And I, you know, just to be,
Right.
and I think that people could go away and they could stop, or they could support each other and they can help to continue. Knowing what we've laid out in this panel, that these are very deeply felt, basic actions based on our faith, I don't think this is going to go away. So how are we going to help refugees when it's going to be much more difficult to do those things? Not just demoralizing, but potentially a lot more serious consequences. And I think that this is a very important question to ask, because refugee work in the United States is changing. And working together and giving each other support is fundamental to that. I think that's been done, but it's been done in a very different environment.
All right.
And I think thinking about how we're going to support each other in the future is really essential to that.
I would just add to that, and then we'll open it up to the floor here. An experience that I mentioned to Beth during the break. Holy Trinity Church, which is just around the corner from here, Catholic church that's affiliated with Georgetown, but not part of Georgetown. Back about 10 years ago, a committee in the parish decided to try to provide some assistance to Syrian refugees. And what they did was they welcomed and supported a Syrian refugee family that had been granted resettlement in the United States here in they're actually living in Virginia. But so the parish committee that was working on this decided, let's see if we can meet these people and help them. They brought them in, they came to the country, and this family of Syrian refugees interacted with a number of other parishioners at the parish. And people got really engaged. And today, the parish is hosting over 20 refugee families. It exploded, the interest. Not only the interest of seeing these are good people, these are good people. I care about these people. They're friends of mine now. But they also saw and learned from them what the needs were. And they decided, and this is a upscale parish that has a lot of very engaged people and know how to make things happen governmentally. So they're moving forward now, not only on hosting these families, but on advocacy. So it seems to me that one of the things that we can ask in the religious community is how to get the members of the community more in contact with the reality so that they don't listen to people coming from the Trump administration and saying these people are invading the country. No, we're hosting them. They're our friends. Yeah. And that makes a big difference. And it seems to me that would be a question about how the religious communities could build up from the grassroots in that way, in a way that might make, in the long run, a policy difference.
Mind if I just pick up on that for a second? I think that's really well said. I think about my own personal experience in having grandparents who fled Nazi Germany to come to this country. That was a huge, huge influence in my life. But I don't know if I would have necessarily been moved to actually work in this space had it not been core memories developed when I was 7, 8 years old of supporting the emigration of Soviet Jewry to the US. That was all we were doing in all the synagogues we're talking about. Get the Jews out of the Soviet Union. There was protests, there was movements, and then actually meeting those people in our communities. And I think what you shared is so powerful because it is in fact what I was going to say. It's not enough, I don't think, to have that normative baseline. We know that all the faiths have it. We know that many of our co-religionists are people who are leading the charge to demonize immigrants and refugees and the other in general. So I think having that firsthand experience is so powerful. And unfortunately, as I've been sitting on this panel, my phone has been buzzing, and I just checked quickly. And it is about some staffing decisions that have been made and some plans that are being put into place about deportations. And my colleagues are talking about ways that we're going to respond to that. But the other message that I got that's buzzing is from a Syrian family that a few of my colleagues and I have sponsored. And they've arrived in the US on Halloween, which was a weird experience in and of itself. Then they had the election, another very weird experience. And I can't listen to the message, so I'm not sure what they're asking about. But I know that they're feeling a week and a half in the country, very nervous, very afraid, very concerned about what this means for their future here. And there are so many people like them. Thank God that over 100,000 people were resettled through the U.S. refugee admissions program last year. For the first time since the mid-90s, it's a record number, thanks to the administration's efforts, which, while we can criticize the Biden administration's efforts, which were very harmful at the border, and we can talk all about that. We're very supportive on the refugee admissions program. There are 100,000 people who came in just in the last year alone, who I am sure, like this family, who are part of that 100,000, are feeling alone, nervous, who have needs that are evolving and changing as they adapt to this country. What a powerful way to be able to not only support them and help them feel integrated and welcomed and part of a new community, but also to connect with them in order to show the next generation. These are not people to fear. These are wonderful, lovely people who are just like us. And I think that's a really important thing to do, to move beyond the normative to that experiential level as well.
Okay, well, we can turn it to the floor then for the people who may have some observations or questions that they would like to raise. Back here in the back there, you can stand up, and maybe you could step a little bit forward so we can all see you.
Firstly, thank you so much for this insightful, I would say, talks, the one and the others. My name is Miriam Visa. I am historian. I am working on precisely Byzantine Egypt and early Islamic Egypt. So it's out of context. I want to first say how happy I am because, just I am between the US and Europe. My home country is France. And I am so delighted to see how Berkeley Center and you all, your organizations, are really dealing with the refugees' perspective within the faith-based. And by the way, Asil, I want just to add a historical point, and I have an observation which I will be very fast. The little historical comment, when the Prophet left Mecca to Medina, absolutely, he was welcomed, and this is also another faith-based example, welcomed by whom? The Jews of Medina and the Christians of Medina, the Arab Christians, because we have Arab, not necessarily whatever community is Syrian, Egyptian, or whatever, the Arabs themselves were native there, and the Jews of Medina. So this is a beautiful example. It's just to highlight this. Now, an observation. I think that you are on a very right track here in the US in dealing with the problem of refugees, because you integrate them properly, unlike in European countries, and especially my country, France. They let immigrants definitely come, supposedly welcoming them by social, the whole social services, absolutely agnostic, anti-religion, of course, religiously, hostile to the name of God, obviously, whatever religion is, France. Voilà, la laïcité, the famous stuff. And they do not properly integrate. They come and they know that in France, generous benefits, so they rely on this, and they don't, they don't let them integrated properly for jobs, for, telling them, yes, you have rights, but you have duties as well. You see? And that's what I see as a difference, and I congratulate you on the way you deal with this issue, unlike Europe, and especially France. Well, I think the UK is more appropriate in dealing with the refugees problem. Anyway, they shut everything, so it's very tough to accept refugees in the UK. But the problem is also seen by many countries like Italy and elsewhere, yeah. Well, that's it. But thank you so much for,
Thank you very much. Yes, other questions or observations? Yes, here in the back. You have the microphone there.
Hi, I'm Matt Hickey from the University of Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh has a very long and proud tradition of welcoming migrants, refugees, IDPs, and with a strong sense of interfaith unity. A key feature of Pittsburgh's pattern of migration is transnational ethnic and religious networks that create strong, distinct communities, historically Italian, Polish, more recently, from Asia, the Middle East, Turkey. This has been wonderful for our community, but unfortunately, going back for a long time, it creates this feeling amongst emerging and current communities that they're being replaced or outcompeted. There's beautiful examples of churches being converted into mosques and Jewish groups praying in churches during shootings, but there's still this underlying theme of replacement both by gentrification and by emerging communities. So my question is, how can faith groups meet the needs of refugees and migrants to create communities where they are, while also being conscious of respecting and integrating local and emerging communities within that community?
Okay, anyone on the panel like to respond to that question?
It's a very interesting question. I'm going to try to take a stab at it. Wish me luck. So, in Islam, we believe that the safety and the blessings of a nation are dependent upon how they treat the most vulnerable, including the poor, the hungry, and the orphan. How your community does in Islam, we believe, is how you treat every single individual on a human level, and are you meeting those humans' needs at their level. So when a refugee community is being welcomed into a community that may already be having challenges, that's the scope of those challenges isn't that there's a preference to one group over the other. The hungry is the hungry. There is no hungry person in this world that's wearing a name tag that says, I am hungry, right? We have to make sure that we are meeting the needs of people, whether they are a refugee, whether they are coming from a lower income community, at any place. Neither takes the place of the other. The goal would be complete integration. And I think one example that I can give is a local mosque here in Virginia. It's pretty well known. They're called Dar al-Hijra. They're kind of infamous. And their social services program is really, truly, I feel like is unmatched, because they're not only serving the refugee community or the lower income community or the neighboring communities around them, and they're not serving Muslims, they're serving everyone, Muslims, non-Muslims, everybody. And in my mind, when we are trying to help the human, we help the human in all of their shapes and sizes and forms. And so if you're bringing a program that's taking away resources from one to give to the other, that's a failed program. And so I think that's really up to the grassroots organizations on the ground, working within their communities, working within their neighborhoods, and making sure, are they meeting the needs of all the people around them, regardless of status.
Don?
Yeah, maybe I'll just give a couple of examples, because I think that there's actually lots and lots of examples of kind of strengthened communities as a result of immigrants moving in. And that's recognized, but there is also that feeling of displacement sometimes. You're right about that. I started off kind of coordinating a political asylum project for Haitians. This is, a long, long time ago. And one of the very first things we did was, or actually Archbishop Wensky did, was to kind of introduce me to the Haitian community in Miami. And one of the very first places we went was to a homeless shelter where the Haitians were cooking the food for the native homeless in Miami as volunteers, bringing the food, cooking the food. I mean, so for my very first days kind of in doing this work, I saw a model like that. And pretty much for 33 years, there's been one model after the next. Any kind of program that we've done, you see that they're open to everybody, pretty much. And so it's a question of lifting up some of that, I think. The other thing that I'm thinking about, which is kind of more personal in my own experience, and it has to do with encounter and interreligious cooperation, was in my own family, actually, where my parents for years and years were part of a Jewish-Catholic dialogue here in the Washington, D.C. area. And their parish and Rabbi Joshua Haberman and his synagogue, they'd meet every week or every month or whatever it was on questions. And at one point, this is right during the beginning of the refugee resettlement from Vietnam. They decided it's not enough to talk anymore. We should be doing some things together. And what they decided to do was they decided is a joint group to resettle a Vietnamese family. And the day came to pick up the family, and they went to the airport, and it was a family of 40 people, right? And so it was great, right? I mean, you have dialogue, you have these connections forever and ever, photos of all of them together at Great Falls, all of this kind of thing. And I think, that couldn't have helped but influenced me and my decisions, although, it's not clear exactly that was linear. I think there are probably other things too. But it all builds on each other, all those types of things. And so for Encounter, I think, it's very important, if we're talking about Encounter and building community, that it has to be personal, it has to be face-to-face, it has to be sustained, and getting, the kids in school, getting them housing, this was back when people that sponsored did everything for refugees. That was sustained, and it has to be a concrete commitment that continues over time. And that's really where conversion takes place and where community is built, I think. And if you look, there's lots and lots of models of that around the country, and that's kind of what needs to be built up.
I would say that's some of the echoing what I was suggesting about what was happening over at Holy Trinity Parish there, where the encounter of people with the displaced on a personal level really can be a chief mobilizing source of the response of the religious communities to these issues. I mean, I say that as a person who spends most of his time sitting in libraries, reading books and writing articles about this issue. And I sometimes wonder to myself, is this doing any good at all? Maybe I should be doing other things on the ground and so forth. And I think it's obviously got to be a mixture of these things. We have to have the formation of leadership that moves forward to say that the parishes have to do something more effective on the grassroots. Yeah. And then the grassroots will feed up to the leadership level and say that we can make something happen, and let me show you what it looks like. So it's a sort of both from the leaders level. Pope Francis is one of the most important advocates of refugees in the world today. But most Roman Catholics in this country don't seem to be buying it. At least the way they're voting doesn't seem to indicate that. And so how to make this thing move back and forth between the level of leadership and the grassroots, or between the grassroots and the leadership, is something that's really challenging, and that's a challenge that is facing us all. So Jose has been wanting to ask a question, or maybe
just
Cynthia
to add on
comment
that, David,
yeah.
I think you really hit one of the key issues, is that it really has to be personal. Mm-hmm. And your story there, a couple of years ago, I interviewed faith-based groups across the country. It was in preparation for a Summit of the Americas meeting. I was going to talk about what faith-based groups were doing. And the ones that I talked to, and it was every faith-based group you could imagine, all different kinds of Christians and Jews and Muslims and other groups as well. And the ones that really showed success were the ones where they had integrated. You can welcome a refugee family by bringing a bunch of furniture and a pile of diapers and paper plates and food and leave it on the doorstep. Or you can integrate a refugee family by bringing them into your home, by having your kids play together, by taking them, to the park and things like that. And the communities that were able to do that were the ones where they felt, sort of like the quote I gave, their lives were changed. Yeah. Mm-hmm. They said they were the ones that were impacted, and they felt the benefit of having welcomed refugees in. They didn't feel like they were just giving a handout to somebody. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's the key. And I do think interfaith work on that is really also critical in our day and age and in our country, because just the act of interfaith outreach already is opening yourself up to somebody different and not just isolating yourself. And some of the problems we've had is people have isolated themselves technologically or moved to locations where they're isolated. And I think that interfaith aspect of it can also really help to open people up. Sorry.
Jose wanted to get involved in this discussion, and then we go back there.
Directly to the point you've raised about how to bring the two levels together, religious leadership from below. I agree, Donald, that the most effective responses always come from the faith communities from below. Look, no doubt about it. But we also need the support voice from the leadership. It's true that Pope Francis has been the most spokesperson, advocate. But 8 years ago, he made very clearly the voice, we need to build bridges, not build walls. This time he said the lesser evil. You have to choose the lesser evil. And this gave, I think, our bishops opening not to speak. And so the fact is that then 50% of Catholics, but this time it was 58%. There was no single voice from our religious leadership before the election on this issue. And I think that there is a responsibility on the part of our bishops to speak up. I mean, now they are concerned. After the election, they've raised some concern. But I think that it was really the silence that was irresponsible, I would say. But I would like to hear your voices, Donald and David.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of bishops have been very strong on these issues, like large numbers of them. Maybe it's a core or whatever it is. And it's hard to kind of follow everything that they've said over the years, but it's been a lot. Not just that, but they respond to every angry letter that they get. They dialogue with it, with people constantly. If they preach this, they're kind of in a battle afterwards, So I think what you don't know is kind of some of the things that they're dealing with kind of on a personal level. Having said that, I feel like when I write things, I often think to myself, I'm going to make some arguments that I hope they take up, and I'm going to say some things that are hard, but that I wish that people would say. I don't. So I feel like any time you hear that these people aren't really refugees, that they pose a danger, that there's too many of them, that why don't you focus on your own, that et cetera, they really do need to be quicker on the take up on that, and some of these things ought to just be totally disqualifying in terms of their legitimacy. But it's not all they do either, right? I mean, they have big jobs, so I feel like I guess I'm a defender of what they've done and feel like they're an easy target. I'm not saying you're targeting them, but as I look at the way that the debate's been, they've been strong ever since I've been involved in it, really, really strong and courageous.
Yes, I wanted to see Azza Karam over here wanted to ask a question a minute ago, and then we'll come over to you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to pay tribute to every single member of the panel. I think you spoke beautifully, and it was extremely touching also to hear the narratives from your respective faith traditions. So thank you very much for that. 2 questions. The first is to you as panelists who spoke from different organizations. The other is really more to the organizers. The first to you as the speakers, could you please mention an example of 1 or 2 projects that you actually worked on together and delivered on together? Any example of that would be very helpful for those of us listening. To the organizers, I have a question, which is, this is about refugees and displaced persons. I don't see a single indigenous person here. And this country was built on indigenous people's spilt blood. Yes. I'm not quite sure why we don't seem to consider that experience should be deeply informative for what is going on then and now, and the karma that this country has that it owes back. And how do we speak about faith without considering the original people of faith. Question. Thank you.
I'll just say thank you so much for bringing that up. That is a 100% valid point. And it resonates very much with me as a Palestinian from Gaza, who, yes. I think for your first question about a joint project, Noah, hopefully you can help me out. Because I know that Islamic Relief and Hayas have done lots of refugee resettlement together, and I think it was in Greece. Am I? Yeah? Okay. Say more.
Sure. Well, I mean, great questions. I definitely agree with the importance of the point you raised, Azza. Thank you so much for that. I think a couple of examples spring to mind. First, just Hayas has a wonderful video. I encourage people to look for it. I think it's called 3 Faiths, 1 Welcome or something similar. It addresses a community in St. Louis who welcomed a family, a Muslim family, and it was Muslims, Christians, and Jews coming together, and each sort of divided, it's like a 6-7 minute video, each sort of divided their responsibilities, and it was really lovely, and it's a really good example. At a more global level, Islamic Relief and Hayas have worked together a lot, and they've been an incredible partner, and I think we're both organizations, as Cynthia rightly pointed out, that are likely to be on the front lines, the firing lines, so to speak, of the next few years, and I think it's really, really important that we maintain the solidarity that we've expressed in the past, and we intend to do that. Islamic Relief has supported really important work of Hayas's in Greece, where we support refugees who are traveling on their way to Europe, including Palestinian refugees and other refugees. Islamic Relief has also supported Hayas's work in Chad, where we work with refugees from Darfur who have fled that conflict, both over the last 20 years and more recently since last April. And in turn, Hayas has supported Islamic Relief's efforts in Turkey after the earthquake there last year. And I think it feels, really special and positive to be able to, as humanitarian organizations, to look and say, hey, you all have access there and a presence there. We don't need to set up a new operation. Let's just support you there, and then vice versa. I think that's the sort of model that we've used. We were also part of, and this is a little bit in the weeds, but we're part of a pledge under the Global Refugee Forum together with Islamic Relief, as well as with Protestant colleagues as well, and we hosted an event in Geneva, which had representatives of every faith imaginable, including indigenous communities, faith actors, which was very important to hear their perspectives as well. And what we're aiming to do is improve the way that we work together as faith-based actors in the refugee welcoming space, and especially to help better integrate the perspectives of faith-based organizations into the humanitarian sector, recognizing that local faith-based organizations are truly, as all local organizations are, on the front lines, the first to respond in times of crises, the last to leave if they ever leave, because they are from the communities where they are working, and also to sort of help them to be better integrated into the humanitarian system, which too often secularism and other values that were mentioned by one of the colleagues here often predominate and exclude faith-based actors. We want to change that and help them to be more integrated and help educate and inform our colleagues who are secular in the space about the important contributions of faith-based actors of all backgrounds.
Latter-day Saint Charities has worked with all of these organizations on a number of different things in this hemisphere and other hemispheres, and with Catholic Charities as well. And in fact, we had a meeting. There's been a lot more organization of faith-based refugee groups, kind of aligned with the UN General Assembly and also some other meetings to try to get faith-based groups, more coordinated. And I think that's a work in progress, but definitely, I think where our hearts are at.
You wanted to go.
I think that the second question is the response also about the organizers. I thank you very much for raising this question. I think that we in the United States should start basically learning from the other white settler societies, recognizing precisely that the real natives here are the indigenous people and not the white Christian nationalists, which call themselves the natives. And so it's very important that we learn, take this a habit and begin any of these events with both the presence or at least the remembrance. So I think that, yes, you are right. You are right, in the United States it's a real issue. Perhaps it's the society that treated worst the natives, and yet we are behind and recognizing precisely them as central to fight any form of what otherwise is populist nativism.
John wanted to say something on that. Go ahead.
Well, not exactly that issue, but kind of, I wanted to say that the groups work so closely together that you could say that the 3.3 million refugees that have been resettled since 1980, that's largely an interreligious kind of effort. I mean, that's an extraordinarily humanitarian program that's now directly in the crosshairs. And it really was faith-based organizations that did the lion's share of that work. My own agency, Catholic Legal Immigration Network, I mean, we started with 12 legal programs. I think they have 300 now that they support. That's through, that's with in partnership with all of these other agencies too. And I'd really like to push too the importance of partnering with community-based groups, like the work that United Stateless is doing now. Yes. We did the report on statelessness in the United States with United Stateless, and what's beautiful about that is then you do a report, you provide them with numbers, and they run with it in terms of advocacy, and they do all the hard work on it. So it's extremely important to have those kind of relationships. And then finally, there was a time in the US when migrants could be indefinitely detained in detention centers. And early on, we were working very closely with the families of detainees, which led to a lot of trainings and led to a lot of litigation. And none of us do any of this ourselves. I'm not saying it's a success, but we were heavily involved in it. And it did ultimately end up as a successful Supreme Court case, so that people can't be lifers in detention, as they used to be called. Okay, so I mean, there's one success after the next over the years, but sometimes it does seem fairly grim in terms of one step forward, 2 steps back, or whatever. But the way to do this well is to work with local communities and to work with each other.
Yes, you wanted to say something.
Yes, thank you. I'm Paola Piscitelli from the community of Sant'Egidio, and I want to thank you all for your contribution, for your work. And I wanted to just underline something as a comment and as an invitation to speak more on that. I think that migration in our time is really marking what Pope Francis called the change of era. So it's not just an extra phenomenon, but it's really marking our change of era. And I think that the faith communities, in that sense, have a great resource and a great energy in themselves. Because I think really that going deep in their identity, they found the creativity, the openness, the energies to encounter others. And that's what we are seeing. So, because I hear also a lot of, worries, that is right. But I also want to say a word of hope, because I think that we continue to go deep in our roots, in what is our faith, in our belief, in our scripture, as you all mentioned. We are also finding the ability to encounter the other, to talk with the other, and to be very concrete. But in a way, the effort, it's long-term. It's not just a solution that is quick, as many of you said. But it's really making an effort in believing also in what we believe. And that's at the root of that, we will find also the joy of the encounter and the future of the encounter. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. Beth wanted to raise a point here. Come right over.
And I'd like to respond once Beth is done.
Thanks. I wonder if you could comment on what I see as cognitive dissonance. You have very strong theological basis for welcoming strangers among some of the people who are most anti-migrant. I'm from Texas, where Christian evangelicals seem to dominate. And in talking with them, I mean, they almost always use terms like invasion, chaos at the border, we've got to stop, we've got to push people back. And then they almost always have a little exception. Well, except for Jose, who's been working in my yard for years, and he's really hardworking,
Yeah.
but everybody else should be gone. And I just wonder how people deal with this gap between what they learn in their religious communities and the way they absorb this misinformation.
Yeah. So I think those are connected, and my response will be similar to both. That I believe that there needs to be a paradigm shift, and I touched on this in my opening, but I want to go a little bit deeper into it. When the migrants left from Mecca to Medina, the Ansar, the Prophet said about them that they exhibited so much happiness and joy and contentment that they were given the honor of helping and being of those of aid to the refugees. And I think our dialogue needs to shift from what can refugees do for us as a community to what are we benefiting actually from helping the refugee. If we can get that paradigm shift and really honing in on that we actually as a society need to be of assistance to those who are most vulnerable, because it will save us. It will make us a better society. We will be better for it. We will be better in community. We will be better for the society as a whole, and changing that paradigm. When you're talking about invasions and people who are coming and destroying our communities, but then except for, that's because we've dehumanized people. Right? We haven't treated them as human beings. But if we could go back and say, actually, it's not that, they need to either be useful or need to leave. No, it's that we are helping and we are better for it because we do.
I would say, just a comment on that, Beth, is that, to see the rise of Christian nationalism, so-called, in this country, this may be related to what you're worried about in Texas, that we've talked a fair amount about Christian response to refugees, and which means relativizing national borders. And that's the opposite of nationalism.
Yeah.
And so there's a really serious problem that we're facing from a Christian point of view, where I come from, in dealing with where do we go forward with both the normative basis of Christian response to refugees, which I think is pretty straightforward theologically, but de facto, on the grounds, there's so much counter-orientation among a number of members of the Christian community that it really makes me worry. And I'm a Catholic priest, which suggests to me that we priests are not doing our job. At least the people doing religious education are somehow failing to get the kind of values across into the congregations that really should be there. And that doesn't mean that it comes down just from religious leaders, but how we find a way to make these normative stands really more effective is the biggest single challenge that I think the Christian community is facing today in response to refugees and migrants. It's not only refugees, it's poverty in this country
Right,
too,
yes, 100%.
because we have the same problem with regard to indigenous poor people in this country. I don't mean indigenous in the sense of Native Americans, but I mean people in this country who are already poor, apart from refugees. The response there is inadequate also.
Yes.
So we have a big challenge in front of us, and I think it's probably not quite the same in the Jewish and Muslim communities, but it's certainly true in the Christian community that we need to move in that direction. So anyway.
Just for
Go ahead.
10 seconds on that.
Sure.
What they're saying is that, no, not this person, is that I'm fundamentally a good person.
Right.
Because I like this individual. Mm-hmm. What they don't, and that's actually kind of a trait, that's a kind of a racist thing, I mean, they used to say the same thing in D.C. here about, African Americans. No, that guy I like, but the rest, forget it, And honestly, I grew up in D.C., So I remember that. I'm sure it's the same thing with Native Americans and other kind of whatever, marginalized groups. But the point is, they're us, That's kind of, these divisions are phony. And if it's your cook that you like, everybody's your cook. You know what I mean? It's kind of, that's the thing that gets lost. And I used to think, well, no, they have good hearts because they're trying to, they like this person. But it's not, that's a dodge. That statement is a dodge. Now, we're not talking about her, not talking about him. Yeah, you are kind of. You're talking about their parents, their brothers and sisters, their community. That's what you're doing.
Well, we've reached the end of our time for this panel. I want to thank all 4 of our panelists for leading us in a very valuable discussion. And I hope that our conversation so far will help us keep moving forward with further reflection upon how the faith communities can respond to the needs of all of these refugees in such large numbers in our world today, displaced people. Lunch is available. There are box lunches back there and sodas and so forth. So I invite all of you to stay with us and have a bite to eat. And then we'll come back at 1 o'clock for, we have a half hour for lunch, and then at 1 o'clock come some case studies. And I look forward to seeing more of you at lunch. So thanks a lot to our panel.